Hi, everybody. I hope I did this right. I hope I'm speaking at the right time. I am so excited to be here and introduce this next conversation that Julissa Arce will be having with La Doctora Laura Gómez. I want to welcome you all to the episode 3 of La Historia Uncovered, a series where we are exploring lesser known Latinx figures in history, but people that we should already start, knowing and learning from. For many of you that know me and for some of you that don't, my name is Zoe Saldana. I'm the founder of Bise. Bise is a startup media company whose mission is to broaden and reshape the existing narrative in America so that we can shine light on the untold stories that reflect our nation. I wanted to partner with Julissa Arce and We All Grow, Latina Rebels, She Se Puede, because I feel that our voices are louder and our messages reverberate farther when we stand as a united front. Julissa has made it her mission to accentuate important conversations we must all be having at our dinner table, in our communities, at our workforce, and in our country. Now more than ever, highlighting important figures such as La Doctora Laura Gómez in our community, celebrating their accomplishments and applying their teachings are imperative for our growth. So I now present to you Julissa, who's an activist, a writer, and nationally best-selling author of My Underground American Dream and Someone Like Me. And she's also the creator of La Historia Uncovered.
Thank you, Zoe, so much for that. So kind. You're such a kind person, and that was such a kind introduction. And I'm just so grateful that you wanted to partner with us in telling these important stories. And I know you have so much going on, so I just continually just so impressed with how generous you are with your time. And so I just want to say a huge thank you from me and from all of our partners as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone, welcome back to La Historia Uncovered. This is now our 3rd episode, and I have been really excited about every single episode we've had. But the moment that I knew that I had to create this series was when I read Professor Laura Gómez's book, Manifest Destinies, The Making of the Mexican American Race. And then her newest book, Inventing Latinos, A New Story of American Racism, came out in August. And I rushed to buy it and then read it in time to be able to incorporate that part of the conversation to today's conversation. As a way of introduction, Laura is a professor of law, sociology, and Chicana studies at UCLA, and is an incredible author of the books that I mentioned, among other books. And as I have said in the previous couple of episodes we've had, all of our guests are professors, authors, journalists, whose work has been a really great source of inspiration in my own writing and as I'm working on my 3rd book, Rejecting Assimilation. And just before I bring Laura up, a very quick note, I really need your help. We need your help in spreading the word about La Historia Uncovered. So if you're watching with us live, please tweet, post on Instagram, use the hashtag La Historia Uncovered. And my handles on Instagram and Twitter are both at Julissa Arce. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Julissa. What a generous introduction. And I'm really honored to be here talking with you and excited to be able to communicate some of my ideas with the audience that you have.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've been like super stoked to have this conversation with you. And to be honest, like I've also been a little bit nervous because these topics of Latino identity, race, racism within our community and within the American dynamics of race is a little bit scary sometimes. But these conversations, as Zoe mentioned, are super necessary. And, when I was done reading Manifest Destinies, I wished that there was more. I had so many more questions. And then Invented Latinos came out and you helped sort of continue that dialogue and answer some of those questions. In the epilogue of Manifest Destinies, you share a question that your son asked you when he was a kid. And he asked you if y'all were white. And I think he said something like, back when there was slavery? Where were Mexicans white or black? And I have to tell you that when I was a kid, I had a similar question. Not so much if my family and I were white, because I knew that we weren't. Like from the time I was 11 and I immigrated to the U.S., like I knew I was different. But I did have a similar question in the sense of like, where were we and what role did we play? And so, where I want to begin the conversation is with exploring this idea of mestizaje as a national identity in Latin America. And you write that mestizaje promotes anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism. So how and why did mestizaje become the identity that many Latin American countries wanted to promote? And just for people that might not be familiar with the concept of mestizaje, what is it?
Yeah, so that's a great starting question. I wanna just kind of link back first of all to that question that you identified. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, where I am quoting my then 10-year-old son, Alejandro, who's now 23 years old, and probably would be embarrassed if he were watching this conversation. He's not. But I think that basic idea that you had as a kid was, how do I understand where we fit? Where do we fit in the American story? And it's something that I think we're still working on, right? We're still trying to figure that out, and it's still very frustrating that we're still asking those questions. The generations today are still asking them. So I think that as we move along, we'll be able to hopefully shed some light on that. But the question that you asked about mestizaje, which in Spanish means racial mixture. Mestizaje, I grew up with the idea as my parents were both, they were both taken by the Chicano movement and active in political activities and the Chicano movement. And so I was very lucky that I grew up with this strong sense of pride of being a mestiza, and this sense of, that we were indigenous, but then we were also, had European ancestry. But so to me, it was always a positive idea. But when I started to do research on how that concept was used in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America who were motivated or who were inspired by Latin America, I saw that there was actually this very negative side to it. And so the idea first came up, in terms of the national ideology of mestizaje, it came along in the 1920s in Mexico. And so it comes in independent and post-revolutionary Mexico with this idea of la raza cósmica, which many people have heard about from Vasconcelos. And this idea of raza cósmica was the idea that all the races of the world would combine and become one. And that one cosmic race, right, would be that was the aspiration. And it was one way of bringing together Mexico after the revolution. Well, we're all mestizos, right? But it also had the effect of just sort of pressing down against Afro-Mexicanos and indigenous Mexicanos and saying, you know what, we want you to assimilate and become mestizo, and if you don't, then we're going to just pretend we don't see you. Right? And like I said, this was happening in Guatemala and other parts of Latin America as well. And I think that is part of the reason that we still today, within the Latino community, that we still have yet to fully confront our anti-Black and anti-Indian racism in our own communities. I think we're doing better. We're doing better than we had been doing on this score. In fact, there's more visibility in film and in even television, but in commercials, in music. There's more presence, I think, of Afro-Latinos in particular, but there's still I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have to confront that internalized anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism that is still very strong in our community. So it's important to be aware.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think, when I think about mestizaje, like one of the things that I find wrong with it is that even though mestizaje is supposed to be the mixing of the races, right? And we're supposed to be like part indigenous and have some European blood because colonization. But then I think that this idea of mestizaje centers that European blood, right? And it becomes a sort of like, I always joke that, if you spend enough time with a Latino, they'll tell you about their abuelito de ojos azules. Like every Latino wants to claim that we had a grandpa that had blue eyes and that was a Spaniard, because we've learned all of our lives that that's the part of our identity that we should celebrate. When, you saying like you grew up really proud, I did too. And so I always used to just be like, yes, like we're sure, like we have some Spanish blood, but like the majority of my blood, and I know you talk about sort of DNA test and how people are doing and so I did a DNA test, right? And it was like 75% indigenous. And I was like, yes, like I knew it, I've known it all my life. And now I really know it. And so, but like this idea of mestizaje, I think kind of comes with us, right? When we immigrate, like those of us that immigrated, that idea comes with us. And then in particularly in Manifest Destinies, you spend a lot of time talking about the Mexican-American War, the invasion of the U.S. In Mexico, and how Mexicans becoming part of the United States because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the U.S. viewing Mexicans as a problem. And so they wanted to draw the border such that we had so the United States got the most amount of land with the least amount of Mexicans, right? But some of those Mexicans did become citizens. So can you tell us about that process of how Mexicans became U.S. citizens back in the 1800s, mid 1800s, and how that complicated our place in America and complicated the race dynamics in America, in the United States?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a really perceptive way that you set it up. One of the things that I was hearing you say as you were talking about mestizaje is that we don't realize, and let me just say that Mexican Americans are 70% of all Latinos in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we're a huge chunk, right? And Mexicans are actually, we have as much African ancestry as Spanish ancestry as a nation, right? And yet we don't see that so prominently, right? Now, one of the reasons we don't, which you're hinting at in this question, is that because the Americans, when they invaded Mexico and then took half of Mexico's territory, which is where I'm sitting right now in California and all over the Southwest, right? They also incorporated those people. It was 115,000 Mexicans who overnight became American citizens. But the Americans were if you look at the press from that period, so 1848, when you look at the press, you look at the congressional debate about the war and about whether or not to ratify the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the war. What you see is that there's a real hostility on the part of Americans to the mongrel race of Mexico. So it's precisely that mestizaje that was a problem for them, right? Because they said, oh, these people are not Spanish. They're just Indians, or they're nothing. They would say things like, quote, they're nothing better than Negroes, right? That was the mentality. So I think that also shapes our coming into this country, right? So I write about the original Mexican Americans, those who overnight, they went from being Mexican citizens to being American citizens. Mm-hmm. And the critical thing is that in 1848, when this happened, only whites could become naturalized citizens in the United States. This was before the Equal Protection Amendment, before blacks were allowed to become citizens. And so Mexican Americans, from that beginning of being part of the US, we're in this kind of what I call an off-white category, because we are recognized as legally white for the purposes of becoming US citizens, but we're socially not white and socially subordinated. And it's that tension that I really explore in Manifest Destinies. And it is happening at a time when African Americans are being treated much worse, right? In terms of slavery, in terms of the Dred Scott decision decided by the Supreme Court, which is seen as a precursor to the Civil War, which says that even free blacks could not be citizens of the United States, right? So that is a really undertold part of our history.
Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of comments come through, so I'm glad to see that there is a conversation happening in the chat. I forgot to say this in the introduction, but we are going to have time for Q&A. If you do have a question, I will ask you to put it into the chat when we get to that part, because since there are so many comments, it'll be hard to go back and look for those questions. So because Mexicans got the right to become citizens at a time when only white people could, it sort of set up this false illusion, I think, for Mexicans and then Latinos that came after, that because we were legally white, that we could also have the same rights and the same protections as white people. But as we have seen throughout history, that has not actually been how it has played out. And there is this sort of like dichotomy that I see in history of Latinos, and specifically Mexicans and Boricuas, who were, the first two groups to really the first two groups of Latinos to come to the U.S. I see this, this sort of idea of wanting to fight for civil rights because Latinos were discriminated against. They did face racism, whether it was in lynchings in the Southwest, whether it was school segregation, with the excuse that these Mexican American students didn't speak English and therefore they were segregated from the white kids, whether it was in jury duty where people were sentenced to life in prison and there was not a single Latino in the jury, even though that district was like majority Latino, and on and on and on, right? But one of the things that was so frustrating to read when I was reading your book, and I wanted to like shake these ancestors and be like, you're not white, stop arguing that you are, because there's this dichotomy of like, we know we're being discriminated against, but then when we were fighting in court to have more rights, we were doing it on the basis that we were legally white. So how did that play out? How did all of this play out in the courts as we were fighting for our rights?
Yeah, it is frustrating. Now, I want to just say one thing, which is I think even as these Mexican American lawyers that were arguing in the 50s were saying, we're white, but we're being discriminated against, I think that they still knew they weren't white. But I think that they were clinging to that whiteness in a formal legal sense because they felt like without it, they were going to be treated as badly as African Americans were. So, the case that you're referencing in particular is, it's called Hernandez versus Texas. And it's actually decided in 1954, the same year of Brown versus Board of Education, the school desegregation case. And they actually appear right next to each other in the Supreme Court Reporter. But people don't really know about the Hernandez versus Texas case. Even law students many times, will finish law school without knowing anything about it. And so there's a number of us who are trying to kind of give more attention to that case so that it will be taught and and studied, especially now that Latinos are, soon going to be 30% of the US population within a few decades, right? We need to know this history. And as you said, it's a history it's the 20th century history of discrimination against Latinos focuses on Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans because they're the oldest standing groups in the US, right? But so I'll focus the story on two examples involving Mexican Americans from Texas, actually. So the Hernandez case was a case about jury duty. And so a defendant was convicted, Mr. Pete Hernandez. He was convicted of killing Joe Espinosa in a bar fight, actually. And so, you might think, well, why did the white law enforcement people even care that much about this one Mexican killing another Mexican? But he was prosecuted, and the normal kind of thing would be it's a bar fight. It should have been manslaughter, but he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to prison for life. And no, even though he was convicted in a county that had 15% Mexican Americans who were citizens of that county, in 25 years, no Spanish surname person had ever been even considered for jury duty, much less actually on a jury. So the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, but they almost lose the case because they're arguing that they're white, but they still should be protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, what helps them is, even though they're saying that we're white, they're saying, look at this discrimination that we're experiencing. And for example, things like at the courthouse where they were having the arguments in the appellate case before it got to the Supreme Court, there's two men's room in the basement of the courthouse. And one says, hombres aquí, right? Men here in Spanish, and Negroes, right? So there was one bathroom for them, and then there was another bathroom that was unmarked for white men. They also had all kinds of evidence showing about the fact that Mexican Americans weren't graduating from school, and all kinds of very powerful evidence that ends up convincing the Supreme Court that the Mexican Americans are protected by the Equal Protection Clause. But because of this argument that they were not non-white, right, that they were still part white, the Supreme Court says Mexican Americans can get protection under the Equal Protection Clause, but only if they prove in each case that there is discrimination in that locality, right? So that means if you're in Albuquerque making the argument, you have to prove there's discrimination. If you're in San Bernardino making the argument, you have to prove that there's discrimination, right? Rather than there being a nationwide kind of assumption like there is with African Americans at the time. Now, the second case, do I have time to give you one more?
Yes, please. Yes, absolutely.
Is a school desegregation case, and it's from Houston in 1970. And what's interesting is that by this time, by 1970, Mexican Americans they don't want to claim that they're white by that point. The Chicano movement has happened, and there's a consciousness of, well, look, this is not getting us anywhere to claim that we're white. And the African American parents had sued the Houston schools to desegregate after Brown versus Board of Education. Here it's 1970. That case was decided in 1954, but the schools are still segregated. The Houston schools respond by saying, oh, we'll make your school desegregated. We're going to put these Mexican Americans there. And since Mexican Americans are white, schools desegregated. And the Black parents and the Mexican Americans say, that's not desegregation. Desegregation would be if there were white students attending these schools. And this is a multi-year litigation. And in the end, the Mexican American and African American parents win. But it was a struggle because of that prior strategy of claiming that they were white. It was a much harder battle to win, Now, I guess one other thing that I want to just mention here is African Americans have been segregated in schools or had been segregated in schools under the law. So that's called de jure segregation. But Mexican Americans were not segregated under law, under statutes that said there had to be segregation. So that was called de facto segregation, right? But the effects to the children were the same,
right?
I would argue. But the legal strategy was different. And that kind of goes back to that kind of in-between status that we were talking about before, where Mexican Americans are situated in the US racial hierarchy a little bit higher up than African Americans. And it also pits those groups against each other, right? So we have that historical legacy that we still have to deal with even today.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I think is, that's part of what, just learning about this. Well, so a couple of things. One is I am really, really happy and glad that I have been able to learn about all of the different discrimination and racism that our people face in this country, because I never learned about any of that in school. Like I never learned about Westminster versus Orange County that came a few years before Brown versus Board of Education. Mm-hmm. I wondered, going back to the sort of the opening with your son, like I wondered, where were we? Because in my own experience, in my own real life, I experienced racism. Right. Even in the 7th grade, when a white kid named Justin said, "Why is she in the honors math class? She's a Mexican. She can't even speak English." That was a year after I came to live in the United States. And so I knew, but I also didn't know because these things are not taught in our schools. So I'm really glad I learned about it. And now as an adult, learning more, and through your books, learning about this stuff, it is really frustrating to know how much justice has been delayed for our community because for such a long time we wanted to cling on to whiteness. And we believed that if we could just assimilate enough, that we could be viewed as white people and therefore we would have rights, instead of fighting for our rights because we are human beings and because we deserve them. As Mexicans, as Latinos, we deserve to have those rights. Not because we're white, because we're not, but because we deserve them. And you mentioned, and I'm gonna a little emotional talking about this because it's really I just want to go. I just sometimes want to. I wish I could have a time machine and go back and sort of tell them how it's gonna play out. Let me tell you how this is gonna play out, and it's not gonna be good. Let's have a different strategy. And it was also kind of embarrassing sometimes to read about how so many Latino leaders refused to work with the Black community, and how they try to distance themselves from the Black community. I understand why they were doing it, right? Because they just thought, we want to live in peace, we want to have rights, we want to have opportunities, and if we are viewed as a minority, we won't. And then you mentioned the Chicano movement, the Boricua movement, and then I started getting really pumped up, right? Because I was like, yes, finally we're realizing this. And I'm kind of, there's a lot that happens between the conversation we're having and the question I'm about to ask you. And so I really encourage people to buy both of your books, and we're putting links in the chat where people can buy the books because there's a lot to learn. But I'm fast forwarding a little bit to this. You write, and I want to get this quote right, so I'm pulling it up. You write that the tendency to think of Latinos in ethnic terms perpetuates the idea that Latinos are perpetual foreigners. And that is a little bit of the Latino identity, right? Because I'm an immigrant. I came from Mexico. I was born in Mexico. I came here. But then there are Latinos who were descendants of that 150,000 Latinos, Mexicans that came as a bounty of war. And they've always been here. They've never immigrated, and generations of people have been here. And yet, I bet that everybody who's watching, who's Latino, has been asked, where are you from? Mm-hmm. And then a follow-up. But where are you from? because there is this idea that we're foreigners. And so my question is a little bit loaded, which is then the suggestion that we should be considered a race? And how do we solve for Afro-Latinos, Black Latinos, and Indigenous Latinos feeling like this is another form of mestizaje that erases them?
That's a really good question. You kind of gave it a good twist at the end that makes it very challenging, Julissa. Yeah. I do think that, so my own family, my mother's side, or third generation through her father, and on my dad's side, we do have those roots going back to those. We never immigrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So, it's that's a little more common there. There's been less immigration there compared to people who've been there a really long time, but there's still been plenty of immigration over the years, right? So it's a mix. It's not just like all your grandparents or ancestors are from there. It's
right.
It's a mix, right? But I do think that I think it's important for us to recognize Latinos as a racial group, because I think that that's how we see ourselves now. And I think that's how others see us. I always say, look, white nationalists, they don't have any problem identifying us, right? They don't have a problem putting us into categories. So they don't care if we're, they're not going to say, oh, you're ethnic and you're sort of white. No, that's not what they think, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do think that the question that you've raised about what does that do, and I think that we're going to talk about this in the next question, but about the census, right? Because I think that's one place where we can really see those, we can find a way so that we're not disappearing Afro-Latinos and Indigenous Latinos, but still have this truer recognition that, well, in the United States, Latinos see us as a race of Latinos, right? So I think that that's kind of inevitably where it's almost like that's already where we've been. We got to catch up to it, at least in the last 20 years.
Yeah. And, I think, and this is the part that is the difficult part of the conversation for me to have, because, I agree with you that Latinos should be considered a race. And it goes back to, first, I think I have to just, establish that if we can agree that race is a social construct, right? That society instills meaning into race, and racial categories have changed over time. Right? Like back in the 1920s, white was not a race. There wasn't just one white race. There was like many categories within white people, and then they became white. There's a great book, When the Irish Became White, and Working Towards Whiteness, that talks about this stuff. So if we can agree on that, right, that race changes and the meaning of race changes. And then we get to this conversation about Latinos being a race. And part of the difficulty, and I'm just gonna say it instead of prefacing it so much, which is that I have felt since I was a kid that I don't fit in this dynamic of race in America, because the race dynamic in America is black and white, right? Is a very real, very deep racism and oppression of Black people in this country, and white supremacy. And then, where do we fit into that conversation? And I think that actually and you say this, that thinking about Latinos in ethnic terms actually pits us against the African American community, the Black community, because now there's a distinction amongst us versus truly viewing ourselves as not the same, because we have experienced the world differently. And you say, you know, that historically speaking, specifically Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have had privilege that non-Black Latinos have not. So I agree that you know, Latinos should be erased. There's still this question of like, how do we solve to make sure that all Latinos are included in that, and that we view Latinos not just as people who look like you and I look, but Latinos that look very different, and who have experienced the world in a different way. So all of that to say that the deadline to fill the census is October 5th. Very, very sharp turn there. And so I want people to fill it out.
It's October 5th right now. That may be pushed later.
Yeah, right? But don't wait. Don't, you know, I'm going to.
Well, that's true.
Don't wait. Don't wait, because if it doesn't change and you miss counting yourself, and I love that last chapter in your book where you say, to count, we have to be counted. And so going back to sort of the census, because a lot of this conversation stems from the census. And I did a very unscientific survey on my Instagram when I filled out the census and asked people, what did you put for race? And I got so many different answers, but the most answer that I got, and it is in line with some of more scientific research findings, most people put other, right? Because they felt like they didn't fit.
Most Latinos.
Yeah, most Latinos. Yes, sorry about that. Most Latinos put other. And you mentioned that in the 2010 census, over 40% of Latinos checked other as their race. So what does that tell us about how Latinos are viewing themselves?
Yeah, well, I thank you for all of that you said as a preface to get to that, Julissa. That was really, we really enjoyed that preface and getting there to this question. So, okay, so to answer this question, we have to go back in time. So let's go back first to 1970 and the 1970 census. And it was notable for a couple of different reasons. Number one, that was the first year that we had self-identification, because it's the first year that we filled out the census ourselves. We didn't have enumerators who'd come door to door and they'd fill out your census and they'd decide what racial category you were, not asking you, right? So number two, there was nobody who was counting Latinos. Latinos were just assumed to be white. So MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Foundation, which then was under the leadership of Vilma Martinez, who was president at the time, she sued the Census Bureau and the government, said, you've undercounted Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans because you know, you just were not anywhere to be found. There was no national count. So it was that lawsuit, which actually was thrown out of court. So it didn't win the lawsuit. They didn't win the lawsuit, but they won because they got the census to then say, basically, yeah, we're going to count Latinos. And so the so-called Hispanic ethnicity question was born. And that becomes a question starting in 1980, and it's still a question on the census. And so what you were referring to as your own dilemma, and you don't know how many people have told me they have the same dilemma of, oh gosh, what box am I supposed to check? You know, I don't like those boxes, right? Because there's the Hispanic ethnicity question. Everybody in the country has to answer, are you Hispanic/Latino or not? But then they have the separate race question. And on the race category, there's white, Black, Native American, right? Or American Indian. And there's a bunch of different Asian American categories. And then you go down to the bottom and it says other, right? And since 2000, we've been able to check as many of those boxes as we want. But it's very startling that so many Latinos continue to check other. So in 2020, next year, in 2021, probably the second half of 21, when we get the results of this year's census, the second largest race in this country will be other. Which should bother all of us, right? Because why is it that we don't have, and it's going to be all Latinos. Latinos are the only one who are checking other. It's like a teeny percentage of everyone else, but it's Latinos who are checking it. So some Latinos are checking white, right? That's actually a pretty good chunk. It's about 45% of Latinos. About 6% are checking Black, about 3% are checking Indian, and another 3% multiple categories, right, of those groups. But the Census Bureau itself has been very frustrated with Latinos, and to the point that in 1980, they just said, oh, all these Latinos who checked other, all these Hispanics, because they were using that term then, who checked other, they must just be confused. We're just going to put them into the white category. So there wasn't even the other reported, right? The other Latino, I call them other race Latinos. In 1990, the census used something called hot decking. And hot decking was this really bizarre practice where they said, oh, if a household says that they're other, they must be wrong. And so we're going to actually mark them by what their neighbors are. So if their neighbors are Black, we're going to call them Black. If their neighbors are white, we're going to call them white. And it's only after 2010 did the census say, we've got to do something about this. This is a problem. And so they did extensive research to decide that the way the census should handle this in 2020 was that there should be a Latino category on that race question, a Latino box, right?
Yeah.
And that was, when they did all these studies, they found that the people who used to check other race, they were all happy to check Latino. So were most of the people who checked white on the census. They were very happy to check Latino instead. And those 6% who checked African American, they were still checking African American, but then they were checking Latino as well, right? But the Trump administration said, no, we're not going to change the 2020 census. And to me, that was just the first of several different strategies or tactics that you've seen Trump engage in that show that he doesn't want to get an accurate count of Latinos. So
Right.
there was that. There was the citizenship question, which the Supreme Court said in summer of 2019 that he wouldn't be allowed to add. There was a couple weeks ago, he said, well, he's not going to report undocumented persons in the count. A court stopped that because the Constitution says that the census has to be a count of every person in the United States, not every adult, not every voter, not every citizen, every person. And then the latest thing also is this saying that the census is going to be finished early, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic. And a judge put a stop to that. And then they announced this new date of October 5th, which I predict will be thrown out by that same judge, Judge Lucy Coe up in San Francisco. So where does that leave us at the end of the day? I think that it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, is we know that we're not white, and yet people keep trying to tell us that we are. I've been surprised by some commentary recently in connection with the presidential election that Latinos are white, and it's like, when is this going to die off?
Right.
We need to have a recognition that Latinos are not white, but that doesn't mean that we have the same history of oppression as African Americans.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that all Latinos have the same history. We still have colorism, just like African Americans still have colorism within that group. There still is colorism within our group, right? That those Latinos who are darker skinned, who have African or indigenous features, they're going to be treated worse, etc. They're treated worse by the police. They do worse on education and income and so forth. So, those are some of the very complicated dynamics. And I also join join you, Julissa, in telling everybody, please fill out the census and have your family members fill out the census and your neighbors if they haven't already.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that. That's like I always tell people, it's a lot to unpack. And even in this like 1 hour conversation, we can't possibly touch on every part of it. Your books certainly are a way to keep the conversation going and to learn a lot more. And then within your book, then you reference a lot of other books that I have now gone and bought and started reading. And so we can continue to sort of understand this and get different perspectives, listen to different people. But I think ultimately for me, I think that our desire to be seen as a race, my desire to be viewed as a race, is my assertion that I am not white, and
Right.
rejecting whiteness and wanting to be defined by what I am rather than what I'm not. When I see people saying non-white, non-black, I think that's defining me what I'm not. And I don't want that. I want to be defined by what I am. Okay, we're going to switch to the Q&A portion of this.
Okay.
So if you do have a question, please put it in in the comments now. Okay, so this question from Monica. What are Professor Gómez's thoughts on mainstream media role in perpetuating anti-Black, anti-Indigenous sentiments? Telenovelas usually give white passing Latinx leading roles. Yes.
It's a huge problem. And it's not only the fictional, TV, but also like newscasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like look at Spanish language media and even the media of like places like Los Angeles, who's doing the local news. You see tremendous bias toward, people who look a little bit more like us, Julissa, than, like Afro-Latinos or completely indigenous, Latinos. You don't see those people on the news. And this is something that has been the product of some stereotypes, some of it perpetuated by advertising and other elements of the media, and it's really an ongoing problem. And I think it's not going to change until we're telling our own stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's beginning to change. We're beginning to see more diversity, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a problem because even in Latin America, like when I lived in Mexico, right, when I was growing up in Mexico, it was the same thing, like my favorite actors was like Thalia, and like she's very white, and Gloria Trevi, and all of the telenovela stars, they were all white Mexicans. And I think that's because white supremacy is not exclusive to the United States. White supremacy exists in every part of the world, and we have to continue to fight against it in every possible way. So, and especially I think within our families, within our communities, because that's how we're going to finally be able, I think, to make progress and stand together. So, okay, next question. Let's see. How has, and I'm gonna say this name wrong, I know it. How has Gloria Anzulda's work influenced, shaped your understanding of mestizaje? I see the problem in using mestizaje as a descriptor, but I was curious to see how y'all's views connect.
Gloria Anzaldua's work, I have to confess, I have not read it in a while. It was very influential to me at a particular stage in my career, earlier in my career. I think that, that she was still working in that paradigm coming out of the Chicano movement, where to say that we were mestizas, that was a real thing of pride to say that, right? And we felt like insane, because she's like probably a little bit older than me, a little bit senior to me, but still coming out of that post Chicano movement kind of scholarly generation. Maybe she's a little bit older than that, but not much. I'm just trying to place her generationally, right? And I think that it was still like, we still viewed it as, it was we were proud that we were mestizas, right?
Mm-hmm.
We didn't see that we didn't see the negative side of it, you know. And I think also keep in mind, you know, when I was talking about that mestizaje, I was talking about Mexico and Latin America. In the United States, there has never been an official recognition of our mestizaje, but it's been assumed that because we have sort of, I like to say, the reverse one drop rule, we have one drop of white ancestry from Spain, that's enough to get us into this kind of ethnic category or this kind of off-white category. But, you know, we're still treated as mestizas and mestizos, you know, here. So yeah, it's a good reminder. The question is a good reminder for me to go back and reread Gloria Anzaldua's work.
Yeah, and you know, I think part of it is these things don't have to be. I think part of what even I've learned from this conversation is that things are not so definitive and so clear cut, right? Such that we can be both proud of saying we're mestizas and question what it means and question how our identities oppress other people, how our identities make us the victims of oppression and racism. And it's okay to question things, and at the same time, because the other part of like mestizaje to me, or being mestiza, I think being mestiza, you know, going back to what I said earlier, it's like being mestiza says to me that I am proud of those indigenous roots, right? Because I also have a hard time, even though, you know, I said my blood is like 75% indigenous, but I do have a hard time saying I'm indigenous, not because I am not proud of it. I am proud of it. I am very proud of being indigenous. But the reason I have a hard time sort of just asserting I'm indigenous is because I recognize that I have not had and have not lived through the same experience that a person who still speaks their indigenous language, who lives in an indigenous community, what they have lived through. So that's why for me, I don't assert saying I'm indigenous very often. I do sometimes, because I think I'm trying to reclaim that indigenous part of my identity that was stolen from me and from my ancestors when the Spanish came to Mexico. And in some ways, I feel like, you know, now it's also being stolen because people then will say that you're appropriating it. So
it's very tricky too. You didn't mention this, but I just want to, I know you're thinking about it. I just want to add to the conversation that we also don't want to trample on Native American, you know, those tribal, you know, communities and cultural communities, right? Which, again, that's something that we don't have because of colonialism, right? But so there's also that I think we want to not overclaim our indigeneity.
Right. Yeah. Okay. We have time for a couple more questions. So maybe we can pull one up. I think we're trying to find them. And if you do have a question again, please post it on here. Okay, question from Zulema Rosales, and that's a very cute kid. How to help our mestizo indigenous children to find beauty in themselves when the dominant ethnic everywhere, and we are so underrepresented.
Yes, and you know, I have, you know, I've said in a couple of other interviews recently about the book that, you know, the first question that we ask when there's a baby born is, we're like, well, what color is the baby? You know, how does the baby look? How does the, right? And, you know, so I think the first thing is we got to stop that.
Yep.
Right. We've got to stop that, like, and embrace, you know, even within each family, if there's enough kids, there's going to be one who's darker and one who's lighter, right? Or one who's the darkest and one who's the lightest. And oftentimes families will give out rewards, even if it's subconscious, parents will do that. And so, you know, we really need to stop those kinds of, I think that a lot of these, it's kind of like, well, anti-Black racism. Well, where do we learn that? Well, we learn it in our families, right? We learn it in our families. And then we learn it in the dominant society, right? You know, it's it's like the question before about the media and, advertising and where we see these things. And so we have a lot to unlearn. And again, I think as we think of ourselves, and hopefully a lot of you out in the audience, you are producers of culture, right? You're producers of content. And so you have the opportunity to change that narrative for your own future children, or your nieces and nephews, or your grandchildren, and whoever is going to come after us.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to mention is there's California, the California legislature passed an ethnic studies bill, and it's waiting for Governor Newsom's signature. But that would be a huge thing, right? Have a mandatory that to graduate from high school in California, you have to take ethnic studies.
Yeah.
And you have to learn some of this history.
Yeah. And we should, I wish that, there's like ethnic studies, but I often think about how, there's like Greek schools and like Chinese schools. I'm like, I want to set up like a Latino school where like all of our kids can go learn Spanish and like learn all of this history. Because I really think like learning for me, learning the history of our people in this country has truly helped me to feel that I belong here. And that has been the biggest gift, I have to tell you, from reading your books and reading all the books from the professors that have kindly agreed to come on the program. And, that's why I'm writing this book, Rejecting Assimilation, because I was, at many points in my life, seeking whiteness. In my speech, I learned how to enunciate and how to sound like the white girls that I saw on TV and the white girls at my school. I thought if I get a college education, that'll, I made those mistakes. And I think a big part of why I did that is because I never learned about people like me. Like I didn't know that you could be fully yourself, that you could bring every part of yourself. Okay, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we'll take one more question. We're going to just pull it up. And, I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined the conversation. Again, I've been kind of trying to keep an eye on some of the comments, although there's a lot of them, but I'm really glad to see so many people having conversations. And, I hope that we keep the conversations going. Here is this next one. Given our U.S. educational system does a very poor job of teaching our community its history in the U.S., how would you suggest teaching supplementing their education?
Well, it sort of depends on the age of your kids, right? Because I think that there's actually great resources in bilingual children's books right now. And some of them are, nonfiction books, like, for example, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, she wrote a children's book about her life, right? She wrote a book for adults too, but, there are lots of resources like that are, lots more than there were when I was a kid in the 70s, right? So taking advantage of those kinds of things, I think exposing exposing young people to culture, right? Some of that culture that is made by Afro-Latinos, whether it's music or visual culture, and by indigenous Latinos, there we still have a long way to go, right? Because I think Afro-Latinos are now, it's not enough representation, but they're culture producers more so.
Yeah.
And indigenous Latinos, we really need to. There's so many so much inequality that they're experiencing, right? Because Spanish is their third language, right? English is their third language, and all of that. And so we really need to do a better job of, I think, reaching there. And like I said, I'm very heartened by this ethnic studies bill if that becomes law, because that would mean that high schools have to develop this course and have to develop a reading list. And maybe that's going to be the difference that keeps some kids in school and get their high school diploma.
Yeah, exactly. And since we're talking about children's book, I'm totally
and going to college.
Yeah, I'm totally gonna plug in my young adult book, Someone Like Me, because that's exactly why I wrote it, right? Because when I was growing up, like I never read books that had a Latina character in them, or that the protagonist was a Mexican American, and less so like someone who was undocumented. So,
I'm a huge fan of Pat Mora's books, bilingual books for very young children, like pre-readers and early readers.
yeah, I love that.
I love those books.
And there's also Little Libros that my good friend Patty Rodriguez puts out, and they're really great. Well, we've come to the end of our conversation, Professor Laura. Thank you so much for joining us. I really, really just enjoyed this conversation. I could talk to you for many more hours, and I hope that when we have a second season of this, you'll join us back. And I also want to say thank you to all of our partners, She Se Puede, We All Grow Latina, Latino Rebels, Vice. Thank you to Zoe for joining us. And especially just a big thank you to all of you who took the time out of your day to join these conversations. There is a lot more to unpack. Not one person has all the right answers. I think we are all exploring what it means to be Latino, what it means to be a Latino in America today. And I encourage you to continue to have more conversations like this in your own social circles. I encourage you to buy Dr. Laura's books, and I will see you next week. Next week, we're going to talk all about Latinas, Chicanas, women in the civil rights movement, in the Chicano movement. And we all know machismo ruins everything. And so we're going to talk about that too. And so I hope that you will join me next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.